Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Anthony Tony Westbrook moved his family into their dream home on the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, he never expected to find himself at war with the self-appointed queen of the HOA, Karen Langford. What started as petty pranks soon spiraled into chaos, testing Tony's patience and resolve in ways he never imagined. Anthony Tony Westbrook was a man who knew the value of peace. At 47, after serving as a naval officer and spending years as a master craftsman, he was ready to embrace a simpler, quieter life. Together with his wife Caroline and their 14-year-old daughter Ellie, Tony found what seemed to be the perfect home, a charming colonial-style house on a spacious corner lot in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. The property boasted a sprawling yard, a cozy workshop for Tony's woodworking, and enough space for Ellie to practice her newfound love of gardening. Most importantly, it was just far enough from the constraints of suburbia to give Tony the autonomy he craved. From the moment they moved in, Tony felt like he had found his sanctuary. The house sat at the edge of a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, HOA, but his property had been specifically excluded from their jurisdiction. This detail had initially seemed insignificant. After all, Tony preferred to manage his property on his terms. However, it quickly became clear that this autonomy, while cherished by Tony, was a point of contention for some of his new neighbors, particularly for one, Karen Langford. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the HOA, a role she took with the seriousness of a military commander. In her mid-50s, with a sharp blonde bob and a collection of oversized sunglasses, Karen was the embodiment of suburban authority. She had a way of appearing friendly at first glance, but radiated an air of unrelenting control that made it clear she wasn't someone to be crossed. It wasn't long before Karen made her presence known. Only 3 days after the Westbrooks moved in, she arrived at their door carrying a pie and a thick booklet of HOA regulations. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with an overly cheerful smile, handing Tony the pie. Her eyes, however, were already scanning their yard as though she were conducting an inspection. Tony thanked her for the gesture, though he couldn't help but feel a hint of unease. Karen wasted no time getting to the point. "I know your property is technically outside the HOA," she said, her tone turning almost conspiratorial, "but we strongly encourage all neighbors to join. It just makes everything so much smoother if everyone's on the same page." Tony, ever polite, declined. "I appreciate the offer, but we're fine as we are. I've always preferred to handle my own property." Karen's smile didn't falter, but something about her demeanor shifted. "Well, I hope you'll reconsider," she said, her voice carrying a subtle edge. "It's always better when we work together as a community." With that, she turned and walked away, but Tony couldn't shake the feeling that her words were more of a warning than an invitation. The following weeks were idyllic for the Westbrooks. Tony threw himself into refurbishing the backyard fence, Ellie planted a vegetable garden, and Caroline began hosting book club meetings on their sunny patio. It seemed like their dream home was finally coming together, but Karen's presence loomed like a storm on the horizon. She seemed to always be nearby, walking her dog past their house multiple times a day, or stopping to chat with neighbors while her eyes darted toward the Westbrooks' yard. Tony caught her snapping pictures of their fence one afternoon, her phone's camera conspicuous against the backdrop of his freshly painted woodwork. When he waved at her, she offered a tight-lipped smile and quickly walked away. Though Tony was content to mind his own business, it became increasingly clear that Karen wasn't. She had a vested interest in the Westbrook property, and her need for control was simmering just beneath the surface. Tony could sense it, but for now, he chose to focus on his family and their newfound home. What Tony didn't realize was that his quiet defiance of HOA rules was seen by Karen not as a simple choice, but as a challenge she would not back down from. The tranquility of the Westbrooks' new life began to erode not long after Tony's encounter with Karen. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable to someone who wasn't paying attention. Random pieces of trash began appearing on the edge of their lawn. Crumpled fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, even a stray magazine. Tony initially chalked it up to careless passers-by, but the timing seemed suspicious. Every few days, the mess would reappear, always in the same spot. It didn't take a detective to figure out the pattern. One day, as Tony was clearing the debris yet again, Ellie approached him with a frown. "Dad," she said, holding up a brochure with a familiar logo, Isn't this from the HOA? Tony took the crumpled pamphlet from her. Sure enough, it bore the bold emblem of the Homeowners Association in a section about community upkeep. He sighed, his frustration mounting. He hadn't wanted a fight, but it was clear someone, likely Karen, had other plans. Things escalated when Caroline came home one evening, visibly upset. "You'll never believe what I overheard at the grocery store," she said, dropping her bag onto the kitchen counter. "Karen was telling a group of women that our yard doesn't meet neighborhood standards. She said we're making the area look unkempt." Caroline paused, her face reddening. "Tony, she's calling us an eyesore." Tony shook his head, trying to stay calm. "Let her talk," he said, though his jaw tightened. "We're not breaking any rules. She can gossip all she wants." But Karen's meddling wasn't limited to words. One afternoon, Tony noticed her standing across the street with her phone raised, snapping pictures of his fence. When he called out, "Can I help you with something, Karen?" she quickly lowered the phone and walked away without a word. It was clear she was building a case, though for what, Tony couldn't say. Determined to protect his family and property, Tony decided to install surveillance cameras. He placed them strategically around the house to cover the front yard, driveway, and backyard. If she's going to keep snooping, he told Caroline, "I want proof of whatever she's up to." As if on cue, Karen made her next move. One Saturday morning, a work crew arrived at the Westbrook property to replace an aging water line. Tony had arranged the job weeks in advance, and though it meant temporarily disrupting his yard, he was eager to have the project completed. The workers had dug several large holes when Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, her face set in a look of triumphant authority. "Good morning, Tony," she called, striding onto his property without waiting for an invitation. "I couldn't help but notice the construction. Were you planning to inform the HOA about this?" Tony set down his coffee and approached her, irritation evident in his tone. "Karen, this is my property. I don't need to inform anyone." Karen raised an eyebrow and pulled a thick booklet from her clipboard. "Actually, you do," she said, flipping to a highlighted section. "According to HOA guidelines, all major exterior work requires prior approval. This is a clear violation, and as such, you'll be fined $3,000. Tony snatched the booklet and scanned the page. "This says the rules apply to HOA members," he pointed out, his voice firm. "I'm not a member, remember. These rules don't apply to me." Karen's face darkened, but she quickly recovered. "Well, it's still a safety hazard. Those holes could cause someone to trip and hurt themselves." Tony folded his arms. "Thanks for your concern, but the crew knows what they're doing. Now, if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave." Karen pursed her lips, muttering something under her breath as she turned to leave. But as she marched off, glaring at the uneven ground, her heel caught on the edge of one of the holes. With a startled yelp, she stumbled forward and fell in, landing awkwardly at the bottom. For a moment, Tony froze, torn between shock and amusement. Then he stifled a laugh and approached the edge of the hole. "You okay down there, Karen?" he asked, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Karen's face was a mix of anger and embarrassment as she glared up at him. "This is unacceptable," she shrieked. "Your property is a hazard. I could sue you for this." "Or," Tony replied calmly, extending a hand to help her out, "you could stop trespassing on my property." Karen ignored his comment, brushing dirt off her clothes as she continued to mutter about the irresponsibility of the Westbrooks. She stormed off without another word, leaving Tony shaking his head in disbelief. Though Tony couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation, he knew it wasn't over. Karen's fall was sure to ignite an even greater fire, and he braced himself for the storm that was brewing. Karen Langford's fall into the freshly dug trench might have been a comical moment, but it was also a turning point. The look on her face as she stormed off made one thing clear: she wasn't going to let this go. Tony knew she would escalate her efforts, and it didn't take long for her next move to materialize. A week later, Tony noticed an unusual amount of activity on the street. Neighbors were stopping to talk in clusters, gesturing toward his property. Cars slowed down as they passed, drivers craning their necks to gawk at the yard. Something was up. Then he spotted Karen across the road, clipboard in hand, animatedly speaking to a group of residents. Her gestures were sharp, her expression one of feigned concern. Tony could only imagine the accusations she was leveling. That evening, Caroline returned from running errands with fresh news. "Karen's been spreading stories about you again," she said, exasperated. "Apparently, she's telling everyone your property is a safety hazard and that you're ignoring community standards." Tony sighed, unsurprised. Let her talk. People will believe what they want to believe. But Karen wasn't content to rely on whispers and rumors. Days later, a folded flyer appeared in Tony's mailbox. It was an official-looking notice printed on HOA letterhead, announcing an emergency meeting to discuss community safety concerns and violations. Though it didn't name him outright, Tony knew this was about him. The meeting was scheduled for the following weekend at the HOA's community center. Tony debated whether to attend. After all, he wasn't part of the HOA and had no obligation to answer to them. But Caroline convinced him otherwise. If you don't show up, Karen will spin the narrative however she wants, she argued. At least go and set the record straight. When the day of the meeting arrived, Tony walked into the packed community center with Caroline at his side. The room buzzed with tension, neighbors murmuring amongst themselves as Karen stood at the front of the room flanked by two other HOA board members. She wore a smug expression, clearly relishing the attention. Thank you all for coming, Karen began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. We're here to address some serious concerns regarding community safety and compliance with HOA standards. She launched into a lengthy diatribe about the importance of maintaining order and preserving property values, subtly weaving in references to certain individuals who refused to cooperate. When Tony raised his hand to speak, Karen hesitated, her smile faltering. Yes, Mr. Westbrook, she said, her tone neutral but wary. Tony stood, his calm demeanor masking his irritation. Let me make something clear. I am not part of this HOA. Your rules don't apply to my property, and any attempts to enforce them are both baseless and overreaching. He gestured toward Karen, and as for these so-called safety hazards, they were temporary and properly managed by licensed professionals. Karen's expression hardened. Whether you're a member or not, your actions affect this community, she snapped. Your negligence puts everyone at risk. Before Tony could respond, someone in the audience interjected. Come on, Karen, we've all seen you snooping around his property. Isn't that a bit much? The room murmured in agreement, and a few heads nodded. Karen bristled, but Tony seized the moment. I have cameras around my property, he said, pulling out his phone. Would anyone like to see footage of Karen trespassing? Because I have plenty of it. He paused, locking eyes with her, including the part where she fell into one of those so-called hazards. A ripple of laughter spread through the room, and Karen's face turned crimson. That footage was taken without my consent, she sputtered. It's an invasion of privacy. On my property, Tony countered. Where you weren't invited. The meeting devolved into chaos as neighbors began debating the validity of Karen's complaints. Some defended her, arguing that she was just trying to uphold community standards, while others criticized her for overstepping her authority. Tensions ran high, and Tony could see Karen struggling to maintain control of the narrative. Then came the final straw. Karen, clearly flustered, announced, if Mr. Westbrook refuses to cooperate, the HOA will have no choice but to take legal action against him. Tony raised an eyebrow. On what grounds? I'm not a member of your HOA. Your authority ends at my property line. The crowd erupted in heated discussions, some questioning Karen's motives, while others whispered about the legality of her threats. Tony stood firm, refusing to back down, his quiet confidence a stark contrast to Karen's floundering attempts to regain the upper hand. As the meeting ended in disarray, Tony left, knowing that the battle was far from over. Karen's desperation to assert control had reached its peak, and he could feel the storm brewing. But what Karen didn't know was that Tony wasn't just standing his ground, he was preparing for whatever she threw at him next. Her next move, whatever it might be, would be her undoing. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread quickly. The murmurs and whispers that began in the community center turned into full-blown conversations among neighbors. Karen's authority, once seemingly unshakable, was now the subject of skepticism and outright criticism. For years, many had silently endured her heavy-handed tactics, but Tony's refusal to submit emboldened others to speak up. Stories of Karen's overreach began surfacing. Arbitrary fines for trivial offenses, threats of legal action for minor infractions, and her unyielding insistence on perfection. But Karen wasn't finished. Days after the meeting, Tony received a formal letter from the HOA, signed by Karen herself. The letter accused him of creating a hazardous environment and demanded immediate action to bring his property into compliance, complete with a veiled threat of legal action. Tony, however, was ready. He forwarded the letter to his lawyer, along with the surveillance footage of Karen trespassing and her fall into the trench. "This isn't just harassment," Tony's lawyer said after reviewing the materials. "She's overstepped her legal boundaries. We'll make that very clear if this goes to court." Karen's legal threats never materialized. Instead, her troubles escalated when Tony's lawyer filed a counterclaim for harassment, trespassing, and defamation. The legal notice, coupled with the undeniable evidence from the surveillance cameras, forced Karen and the HOA board into an awkward corner. The HOA's own legal team advised them to settle quickly to avoid further embarrassment and expense. In a private meeting, Karen begrudgingly agreed to a settlement. She was ordered to pay Tony $18,000 to cover the damages to his property and compensate for the disruption she had caused. The HOA, under mounting pressure from disgruntled residents, stripped Karen of her position as president and issued a formal apology to the Westbrook family. For Tony, the resolution wasn't just about the financial compensation, it was about standing up for his rights and proving that unchecked authority has limits. Karen's downfall sent a clear message to the neighborhood. Overreach wouldn't go unchallenged. The victory was bittersweet, but it was one that marked a turning point for the entire community. The ripple effects of Karen's downfall were felt throughout the neighborhood. Her removal as HOA president marked the end of an era of unchecked authority and overbearing rules. For years, residents had quietly grumbled about Karen's behavior, her arbitrary fines, her invasive inspections, and her tendency to treat the HOA as her personal fiefdom, but no one had dared challenge her. Tony's victory not only removed her from power, but also emboldened others to speak up about their experiences. At the next HOA meeting, the tone was drastically different. The atmosphere, once dominated by Karen's condescension and rigid enforcement, now crackled with energy as residents voiced long-held frustrations. Stories of Karen's abuses poured out. Fines for planting unapproved flowers, threats of foreclosure for minor dues discrepancies, and even a neighbor who had been scolded for parking his car a few inches too far from the curb. For the first time, the community felt empowered to demand change. The HOA board, under immense pressure, resigned en masse, leaving the organization in disarray. In their place, a group of reform-minded residents stepped forward to take the reins. Among them were neighbors who had quietly supported Tony during his conflict with Karen. Their platform was simple: transparency, fairness, and a focus on fostering community rather than control. One of the new board's first acts was to revise the HOA's bylaws. They limited the association's power over individual properties, introduced an appeals process for fines, and implemented strict guidelines to prevent future overreach. They also launched initiatives to repair the fractured trust within the community, including block parties, neighborhood cleanups, and programs to assist elderly residents with yard work and home maintenance. Tony, though not a member of the HOA, watched these changes with satisfaction. He hadn't set out to be a catalyst for reform, but he was proud to see the positive impact of his actions. Neighbors who had once viewed him with suspicion now waved and smiled as they passed his house. Some even stopped by to thank him for standing up to Karen. One older couple confided that they had been afraid to speak out against her for fear of retaliation, but felt safer now that the board had changed. The Westbrooks property also became a symbol of resilience. Tony restored his yard to its former glory, repairing the damaged fence and replanting the grass that Karen's antics had destroyed. Ellie's garden flourished, and Caroline resumed hosting book clubs on the patio. For the first time in months, their home truly felt like a sanctuary again. Beyond the neighborhood, Karen's story had become a cautionary tale. News of the HOA debacle spread through local media, serving as a stark reminder of what could happen when authority went unchecked. Articles about the case sparked conversations in other communities, inspiring homeowners to push back against similar overreach. Though Tony wasn't interested in the spotlight, he was glad that his experience had made a difference, not just for his family, but for his neighbors, and even for people beyond their quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was healing, and for Tony, that was the most rewarding outcome of all. As the dust settled, the Westbrooks found themselves enjoying a peace they hadn't felt since moving into their new home. The yard was vibrant again, the fence freshly repaired, and the neighborhood was undergoing a quiet but significant transformation. What had begun as a battle for autonomy had blossomed into a broader fight for fairness, one that reshaped the community in ways Tony hadn't anticipated. For Tony, the entire ordeal was a lesson in standing firm. Sometimes, he reflected to Caroline over coffee one morning, you have to draw a line in the sand, not just for yourself, but for the principle of it. Tony had never sought conflict, but he realized that his willingness to face Karen's relentless antics head-on had inspired others to do the same. His actions had proven that even those who seemed to hold all the power were not above accountability. Karen's legacy, once defined by fear and control, had become a cautionary tale. Neighbors no longer whispered about fines or feared arbitrary enforcement. Instead, they discussed community gardens, block parties, and ways to make the neighborhood more inclusive. Tony's story became a touchstone for future conversations, a reminder of what could happen when authority was left unchecked, and how resistance, even from one person, could ignite change. The new HOA board reached out to Tony to thank him personally. While they knew he wasn't interested in joining, they wanted to assure him that their focus would remain on fostering cooperation rather than enforcing rules. Tony appreciated the gesture, and though he politely declined their invitation to participate in meetings, he felt a newfound respect for their approach. One day, as Tony sat on his porch watching Ellie tend to her garden, he spotted a familiar face approaching. It was one of the neighbors who had initially sided with Karen. The man offered an apologetic smile and extended his hand. "I just wanted to say, you were right. We should have spoken up sooner. Thanks for what you did." Tony shook his hand, nodding. "It wasn't just me," he said. "It was all of us. We all deserve to feel safe and respected in our homes." As the man walked away, Tony leaned back in his chair, taking in the peaceful scene. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was on a better path. His family could finally enjoy their home as they had envisioned, a place of tranquility, freedom, and community. The ordeal had been exhausting, but Tony wouldn't change a thing. Standing up for himself had not only protected his family, but also set an example for others. In the end, the battle wasn't just about rules or boundaries. It was about creating a community where people could thrive without fear. And as the sun set over the quiet street, Tony smiled, knowing he had found exactly what he had been looking for: peace in every sense of the word.